What's up, guys? Welcome back to another daily Bible reading snapshot. Here in the Old Testament, we're starting a new book, which is really just part 2 of the book we've been reading before, but it's the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is the second half of what we know as the book of Ezra. So both of these really went together originally, but now we're going to see in particular the attention shifts from Ezra as a leader to Nehemiah as a leader. And really Ezra's going to show up throughout this narrative as well. So it's not just about Nehemiah, but now the focus is on Nehemiah. So in chapter 1, we see that he is living in a city called Susa. Okay, sometimes it's called Susa the Citadel or Susa the capital, which this is now the capital city of this big Medo-Persian empire. So the Persians really are in charge here. Remember, it's not the Babylonians anymore. The Babylonians were defeated, in particular, in Daniel chapter 5. Now we see the Persians have been in charge for a while. They've been all the kings we've been talking about so far. Cyrus, Artaxerxes, Darius, all these guys have been Persian kings. So anyway, all that to say, we have Nehemiah here who's the cupbearer, and he starts talking to God. He starts thinking about his old land, remembering how it's lying in ruins. And at this point in time, we hadn't had so much of the rebuilding yet. The walls in particular, those have not been built up. We've got a temple with no walls. That's a bad thing. We've got a city that's not protected. That's a bad thing. So he's thinking about his homeland. And one of the things that happens here is he remembers, and in his prayer, he talks to God and he says, hey, God, can you please just remember what you said to Moses, which this is now quoting from Deuteronomy 30, chapter 30, verses 1 to 5. He says, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. So he's quoting Deuteronomy, which is so interesting. When we study Deuteronomy, it's important to remember that basically all of the Old Testament, you can start to trace things that go back to Deuteronomy. It's such a central document. This is a quotation from Deuteronomy saying, God, you promised judgment and you brought that judgment. Now, God, you also promised that you would bring restoration to the people if they turned and repented and looked to you for guidance. Now, please, God, fulfill that promise and bring your people back to your land. It's similar to what we read in Daniel 9, where Daniel prays and God promises, yeah, we are going to send you guys back and you are going to be people who are going to live in this land again. So chapter 2 is when the narrative really picks up. That was mostly prayer. Now we're going to see, what does Nehemiah do? What does he do with this king? Remember, he's the cupbearer to the king, which means he tasted the water. So like, I have water right here. Well, it's empty now. But it's like your job would be, okay, taste the water before the king can taste it. So, oh, I'm not poisoned? Great. Now, king can take it. So, very close relationship with the king. And one day the king noticed, Nehemiah, why you seem sad? Did something happen? What's going on? Which again, it just shows the personal relationship that Nehemiah must have had with this king for the king to be close enough to know what he was feeling, right? So, he's an important guy. Nehemiah is an important character here, even in this big nation. So it says that quickly Nehemiah prays to God, and he goes back and he says to the king, this is all probably in one setting, he says, how can I be happy if my city lies in ruins? So it says that the king said, all right, you can go. If you want to go, you can go. So he inspects the walls, and it's all done secretly. It's like a secret plot here. But in chapter 3, we see that people start to oppose the work. In particular, in chapter 2, we find out about these people. 2 guys, Sanballat and Tobiah. They become the villains of this story because they are going to oppose the work of God. And we're going to see more about them later. But the big takeaway from Nehemiah's life is that he's a person who takes boldness in God. He prays to God. He gets boldness to do these big, important things. And just remember that if we're ever scared to do the things that God wants us to do, what's the thing we should do? Well, we should turn to God. We should turn to him. We should talk to him. We should pray to him, especially when we're scared, especially when we know something that we should do and we're scared to do it. What's the first reaction? It needs to be the reaction Nehemiah had. Turn to God, pray to God, even if it's in the moment, like in verse 4 of chapter 2. So anyway, those are the big things we take away from the beginning of this book. We're going to read more about it later. But we're in the book of Acts here in the New Testament. We're starting Acts chapter 2, where something very interesting happens. Something miraculous happens. We see that when the Spirit is given in a special way to the church, that a sign accompanies that. Remember, from the Gospel of John in particular, what are signs? Signs are these miraculous things. They're proofs that God gives to everybody that this is my thing that's happening right here. And what's the proof? What's the thing that happens? Well, these people, these disciples, they start to speak in tongues. Now, there's so much confusion about what this is today, and really there shouldn't be, because we need to look to the Bible to define things like tongues. What are tongues? Well, tongues, the word just means languages. So they're speaking languages, but we know it's not just they talked and people heard them and that was all. It seems like people from all these different places. I mean, read through the list of all the different places these people were from, that they understood the language that Peter was speaking in their own language. So what's happening here is not gibberish. It's not, making weird sounds and having someone come and tell you, oh, I feel like that means this. That's not what's happening here. Peter and the disciples, they start speaking, and when they speak, people from all over the world hear it, just like it's in perfect, Google Translate, but just with no mistakes, right? All at the same time. That is a miracle. And part of the miracle, there's a significance to it, isn't there? That this is the day of Pentecost, where Jews from all over the world are gathering to meet. Now we're going to have Peter stand up and preach a sermon and share the truth about Jesus. How can these people know the gospel if Peter doesn't know their language? Well, because God's going to move it beyond just the language of Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and even some Latin. Those might have been the 4 languages that, that's a lot of languages. You probably don't know 4 languages. I certainly don't know 4 languages, but they had a lot of languages. But what about all the people from all over the Roman Empire? Well, God's going to make it happen through this speaking in tongues. So this is something we see at the early church. We don't see it today. Which is why even people who claim to speak in tongues, they cannot be understood by people who do not speak their language, okay? Which is definitionally different than what we see in the New Testament. We see very clearly these tongues were someone speaking and people hearing it in their own language. And obviously some people were confused about that. They're like mocking them for doing this. And we're going to see how Peter's going to start to preach this sermon tomorrow. But very important for us to understand this and to know what to expect, especially in our day and age. So very important stuff. The church is being built, and it's encouraging as we read the first days of the church to know that we're going to take some instructions, especially from tomorrow's reading, about this sermon and how we need to continue the work of the church even today. So thanks for reading with us. We'll see you back tomorrow for another daily Bible reading snapshot.